Well, good day, everybody. Welcome to episode 014 of Code While. This is Shao Miller. At the top right of the page that we're looking at here is a QR code. If you scan it and follow the resulting link, you'll reach the same web page here where you can follow along with the code if you like. In this episode, I'm going to discuss some web browser event handling JavaScript code. While web browser event handling has evolved over time, I find it to be pretty complicated, but I hope to make contact with some of those points of complication in this episode. Unfortunately, it's a pretty long episode, so I've broken it up into multiple parts. In this first part here, I'll just go through an overview as well as some demonstrations, but then I'm going to cover some of the code in greater depth in other parts. All right, so let me get started here. This is the code here. In some old web browsers, there are HTML elements that have an detachEvent function as a property and a removeEvent property that's a function as well. And in some modern web browsers, there are, roughly speaking, counterparts to those functions called addEventListener for HTML elements and removeEventListener for HTML elements. And because of that history there are some complications. The old web browsers, they only had a so-called bubbling phase, but the modern web browsers have 4 phases, depending on your perspective. And so all of that is a little bit of complication that I'll try to sort out here. In modern web browsers, the 4 event handling phases are 0 for none. No event handling phase is currently the phase. 1 for the capture phase, and that is when an event occurs for a web page. It works its way down from the topmost, the greatest ancestor element, all the way through any of the elements that contain the eventual event target element, which was the subject of the event, the original subject of the event. And that's the capturing phase. So all of the ancestor elements get their opportunity to handle the event or work with it. Then it reaches the target for phase 2, the target phase. And then all of the event handlers for the element itself occur. And then for the bubbling phase, it works its way back up the chain of ancestors from the target element, the event target element, to its immediate containing element, to any containing element for that, and so on until eventually there is no ancestor and the next parent element is null. And so those are the 4 phases for event handling: none, capture, target, and bubble. But it kind of depends on your perspective, because there are 2 perspectives to take into account. On the one hand, the addEventListener function and removeEventListener function, they only really distinguish between 2 phases, the capture phase and the bubble phase. When you attach an event handler or an event listener to an HTML element, you specify one of those 2 phases. You don't specify the none phase or the target phase. And the way it works is that during event handling, whether you attached an event handler as a capture phase or as a bubble phase event handling routine, when the event target element is being processed, those will be considered the target phase, even though they were registered as either a capture phase or a bubble phase event handler. So that's a little bit of complication. Coming from the functions perspective, there are only the 2 phases. But coming from the event handling perspective itself and what the event handlers themselves are able to interrogate and inspect, have access to, there are 4 phases. So that's a little bit awkward. Okay, so here's all the code here. I'm just making a code object, which is this inner object. It's got a lot of properties here, but I'm going to cover all of these in other parts of this episode 014. for now, I'll just scroll through them and get on to the demonstrations afterwards. The most exciting stuff is in this dispatch function and in the add class event listener function. So what's the purpose of what I'm doing in here? Well, it could be argued that it's a bit cumbersome to add event listeners, to attach them to HTML elements that are dynamically generated. As you're building a user interface, you might need to add and remove buttons or other HTML elements that you want the user to work with on the web page. But for each element, if it's supposed to have a certain behavior when it's interacted with for certain event types, you have to attach event listeners for those event types to the element. So what I'm doing here is I'm attempting to re-implement event handling as a whole, but instead of registering event listeners for HTML elements specifically, this is going to be a counterpart that permits you to register event listeners for classes of HTML elements. That is, HTML elements can have a class attribute, and it can be a string that has one or more space-separated class names. And you'll often find these used for selection in cascading style sheets, for example, CSS. So instead of attaching event listeners there, I'm going to attach it to classes, but otherwise I'm going to try to get as much parity as I can with this code with the modern web browsers add event listener and remove event listener functions or features. So the big difference there is while you invoke those as functions for an HTML element, instead this code object, the functions it exports that are available to a programmer who uses this code, they will instead call those functions and pass a class name to attach event listeners to and remove event listeners from. All right, so how does it work here? Here are some demonstrations coming up. All right, let me click eval here. In this one, this is a simple demonstration of the phases. So what am I doing here? In this main function, I'm going to check this test name, which is established at the end here as test1. And again here, we'll see it's invoked as test1. And what do we do here? If this code has already been run before and established itself, then it's going to return that previously established test1 code a little bit early instead of overwriting it with this new instance of the code being invoked. And that's because of the replay button at the top of the page. I would like for you to be able to replay all of the code sections of this episode and to be able to explore the same demonstrations. And so by using replay, all these code sections will be rerun or reinvoked, but this handling here that I'm doing, checking if it's already been invoked once, will permit distinguishing between whether or not it's the first time that stuff has happened or it's after the first time that a demonstration has been explored. So this is a sort of a reset section that can reuse or reset in here. And what do I do here? I set this to this code object, inner code object. That's going to be a property called test1 of episode 014. And here's the magic here. I add a class event listener from the episode 014 exports, and I pass it the class code.testName, which is the same thing here, which is test1 as a string. And I'm going to handle click events. And the listener, the event handler, is going to be code.onClick, which is just in a moment below. And I'm specifying true that this should be attached for the capture phase of event handling for this class. And I'm also going to attach the same onClick function as a listener for the bubble phase by specifying false here as the last argument to add class event listener. All right, and then code just returns this code object with these functions and properties. Make elements what does this do? It's going to fetch the logs div on this page by its ID. It's going to make a new div element and assign that to div. It's going to append the div to the logs. And then it's going to specify the test1 class name as the class attribute for the div that's established. Then it's also going to set the inner HTML property of that div with some raw HTML here. And it's going to include a button as a sub-element. And that button is going to have a class, and that class name is going to be the same class name. And then it's going to have the class name as the text for the button, and that'll be the button. So what have we got here? We're going to have a div with a button inside, and both of them will have a class attribute that's set to test1 for this demonstration. Okay, next, on click, this is the event handler or the event listener. It will have event as an argument, and then it's going to have two variables, lm_name and msg for message. lmName will be set as a shortcut convenience to this.nodename.toUpperCase. Every HTML element should have this node name property, and just because of browser differences, I'm going to uppercase them all so that this works across multiple different kinds of browsers. And that's going to be this lmName, the node name type. So it should be either div or button. So here is a message I'm going to build up. It's going to be a string with just a bunch of different lines in it. Test code will be the first line with the test name and a new line. Element, and it's going to have the element name, either div or button. And the phase for the event phase that we find in the event, that's the argument to this function, and a new line. And just for the sake of demonstration, I'm also going to include a property of that particular kind of event, in this case a click event, and it should have either an X property for some web browsers, or if that's not present, it should have a PageX property for some other browsers. So either way, we should get a useful property report for the ClickX feature. And then I will alert a message, and that's about it. So down here, I use setTimeout to schedule that makeElements function from a little bit earlier for the next tick on the event loop for JavaScript. So it won't happen right away. It'll happen in just a moment, and that's what's happened here. As I evaluated this code, it was invoked, it executed, I got this value line with the result of OK from this string, but then just after that, on the next tick, those elements were added to the logs div, which is right here. So here we have the button, test1. So what happens when we click it? We get an alert. It says test code, test1. Element was div. The phase is 1. That's the capturing phase. And click X was 44. Okay, we'll get past that. Now it's going from the containing element downwards. So the next element is the button element. Well, it's the element that I clicked on. And so it's the target element. So now we've moved into the target phase, phase 2. And it still has the same click X there. Now, this was from the registration perspective. This was all the capture phase, even though from the event perspective, we're now in the target phase. So now we're about to start executing the handlers that were registered for the bubbling phase. But again, we're going to have the first one will be on the button, and so we'll still be in the target phase. So if I click OK again, once again, we're still in the target phase, but now we're moving upward through the phases. And it's the button element at the innermost level with target phase, and after that, back up to the div for the top of that bubbling. All right, so that's what that does. And I haven't made any changes, so we can rerun that as many times as we like, and we'll get the same results. Next is test 2. It's very similar to test 1 with only some subtle differences, so I'm not going to explore it in depth. This time it has an abort signal property for its code, and it's an object which simply has an aborted property, which is set to false to begin with by default. And down here, the reset is a little different. Pardon me. If you use the replay button at the top of this web page to reset the state of all of this code, one of those features will be that if this was previously invoked and aborted was set to true, it's going to be reset to false, just like it is right here. So this allows us to get a fresh start for interacting with these demonstrations each time we like. And then down here, this time I'm going to make use of one of the modern web browser complicated options that can be passed for add event listener, which I'm trying to mimic or simulate with add class event listener. That's to pass an options object instead of a Boolean. And that options object, one of the features that it can accept is this signal property. So in this case, I'm passing an options object that has signal, which is set to code.abort signal. And that is this object that was just discussed a moment ago up here. Okay, so it's going to attach for the capture phase, and for the bubble phase, it'll be abortable by having passed this signal with the abort signal here. And how is this different? We create elements just like before. On-click is a little bit different. I'm going to skip over the click because we don't need to demonstrate that each time, the click X message. But down here, I'm going to check if code.abortSignal.aborted is not true, and if the element name is button, and if the event phase is the target phase, then I'm going to set the aborted property of the abort signal in this code to true. And I will also have a message that notifies us that it's going to be aborted. So what happens for all of this here? We get this test2 button. Okay, so now we're in the capturing phase, the div, phase 1. That's not going to do anything different. Now we've gotten down, we're still in the capturing phase from the registrations perspective, but we're in the target phase because we're working with the element that was the event target. But now this is going to match the conditions that I just explored with you a moment ago. And so it's going to attempt to abort the further event handling by setting this abort signal.aborted to true. So we get a message saying test2 aborting, and nothing else happens. The bubble phase of registrations was entirely skipped. It was missed because of the abort signal being set to true. And if we run this again, we get the same result here, but once we get to this button phase, it's going, since it's checking to see if we've already aborted in the past, it's not going to abort anymore because it's already performed that activity before. And so that's it. That's all we get for that. So that's one way to stop event handlers from processing, is to use this abort signal technique. All right, next is test 3. And what does it do? Here, in this one, I'm going to attach on-click for both the capturing and the bubbling phase, but this one has a remove property which is set to false to begin with. And I'm going to allow the replay button to reset that to false as well. But otherwise, it's handling, it checks if code.removed is not set to true if it's false, and if we're the button and we're in the target phase, the first time around, we're going to use remove class event listener to remove the bubbling phase handlers that were attached just up here and in here for a replay. So how does this work here? It's going to pass the test name, test3, the click event, the on-click handler, which is what this is, and false indicates the bubbling phase, not the capture phase. And then I'll set code removed to true and alert about it. So what do we get here? This is the capture phase for the div. Then we reach the button target phase, and it's supposed to take action at this point. So it says test3 removed bubbling, and then that's going to have removed all of the event listeners that were registered for bubbling, and that's it. That's all we get. If we run this again, there'll be nothing to remove, and so we get this, and then we get the button capture, the button's target phase here, and then nothing after that. Okay, what's next here? This is going to use yet another technique to stop processing. This time, it's just going to use the cancel button, cancel bubble property of the event. So those are some techniques that were related to abort signal and the registered event listeners. This time, this is going to be an event-based change, so there's nothing persistent about it. It'll be fresh for each attempt. All I'm going to do here is check if event.cancelBubble is false, then I'm going to set event.cancelBubble to true. And I'll alert to mention that it has set cancel bubble. So we should get none of the bubble phase registrations, even though it was registered right here. The onClick was registered for the bubble phase right here. Does it work? Let's find out. Click test 4, the div on the way down, and then that div set the cancel bubble property. And so we should get to the button still, but we won't get the button on the bubble phase. So here we go. Here we get the button for it during the capture phase from the perspective of the registrations, and in the target phase from the perspective of the event. And let me see. This is from the event perspective. I've used an event-based method to do it. So actually, we should get one more button phase here after I click OK, because it's actually in the target phase, and cancel bubble means to stop bubbling. So we should get one more here. And yes, we do. Okay, we get one more invocation. Even though this was registered for the bubbling phase, from the event perspective, it's the target phase. So we got 3 invocations of the event handler: the div, which set cancel bubble, the button on the capture registration, and the button on the bubble registration. Okay, and we can run that as many times as we like, and it'll give the same results. Okay, and here, this is another event-based approach: stop immediate propagation during the target phase. Okay, how does this work here? This time, it's going to, once the button is the element and we're handling for it, I'm going to use event.stopImmediatePropagation. Nothing should happen after that, and I will mention that it called stop immediate propagation. This one's a little different here. I've attached the onClick handler 2 times for each element. So I've attached onClick 1, onClick 2. Sorry, I shouldn't say for each element. Just to make it clear how stop immediate propagation is different from stop propagation. So I've doubled up here on the number of events just so we can see that here. 2 for the capture phase and 2 for the bubble phase. Each one of those onClicks are down here. All they're doing is they're invoking onClick, but they're passing a 1 or 2 to sort of indicate their sort of a sub-invocation, if you will. Okay, we get a test 5. How does this work here? So the div is reached first, test 5 sub 1. There should also be a sub 2. Here it is, test 5 sub 2 for the div. Then we should get to the button with test 5 sub 1. Button test 5 sub 1, now we're in the target phase. This is supposed to take the action, if I'm not mistaken. This should call stop immediate propagation for the event. Test 5 sub 1 called stop immediate propagation, and that's the end. Nothing else happens. Stop immediate propagation stops the event from being handled even for the current element in the same phase. And so it stopped everything. And because it's event-based, we can rerun that and get the same results each time. Next, is stop propagation. This is almost the same, only I'm going to invoke stop propagation, that function, on the event as opposed to stop immediate propagation. So it's a little bit different. How does it work down here? I'm still doing the same doubling up of event handling just to try to make things clear. But down here this time, I'm also keeping track of whether or not the event has had stop propagation called already. So I've made a whimsically named property called this has been stopped for the event object, just to avoid re-invoking this code over and over again. And if it's the button, the first invocation of the button's event handling, this will be invoked. So I'll call stop propagation, and then I'll set that this has been stopped to true, and then I will alert about it. And what do we get from that? So we get the div sub 1, the div sub 2, the button sub 1. And this is where we should have stop propagation, called. Here it gets called, but then we still get button sub 2, whereas stop immediate propagation stopped further event handling. This still continues on. We're still in the target phase from the event perspective, and so we got to sub 2, but not only that, we're still in the same target phase. We'll get 2 more because we haven't changed elements yet. So I'll click OK. We get, now this is the bubble registration from the registration phase, but it's still the target phase from the event perspective. So we get that one and sub 2 as well. Okay, and that's rerunnable each time because it's event-based. Next, I'd just like to demonstrate that this code, when an event listener throws an error, that's not going to impede event handling. Event handling will continue. So here in the onClick, I'm unconditionally throwing an error. So this is akin to test number 1 otherwise. So we should have 4 messages from these alerts, but I'm going to throw an error after each one. And we'd expect if the throwing was going to interrupt event handling, we would get only 1 message, and then a throw, and then it would be interrupted. But that's not what happens here. We have 1, 2, another 2, and then phase 3. So all 4 messages appeared, even though a new error was being thrown after each one. Okay, test 8. Test 8 is a one-time listener. Modern add event listener implementations permit an options object that can have a once property to specify that the event handler should only be triggered once and then be automatically removed after it's finished. And so this is exploring that. I'm keeping track of whether or not that's occurred with this removed property set to false by default, or after replay it gets reset to false. And here I'm passing an object with the once property set to true to add class event listener. And down here, all I'm doing is setting code.removed to true. And that's just to make a note that it should have been removed automatically. This isn't causing a removal. This is just keeping track that it has been removed. And this once being true is what actually causes the listener to be automatically removed. All right, so let's see what happens here. We get the div on the way down, so to speak. We get to the button, the target here. We get to the button target in the bubble from a registration perspective. And this is where the once was true. So this should be automatically removed after here. And that's going to affect the div because the event handler is going to be removed at this point, and we get nothing else after that. If we click this again, all of that bubble registration has already been removed, so we'll only get 2 messages. The div down to the button, And that's it. All of the bubble registration has been removed already, so there's nothing else. We would have to click the replay button to reset that to get 3 messages again. All right, and the last one here is to use a handle event object. One of the recent complications from modern add event listener implementations is that instead of a function, or as an alternative to specifying a function for an event listener or event handler, you can also specify a handler object. And a handler object, pardon me, can have a handle event property, and that handle event property will be a function. The difference being when you register an event listener with a so-called handle event object, then that object becomes the this that event listeners will find in their functions, as opposed to an HTML element, which is traditionally what you get from a this when you register an event listener that's a function. So this is just going to explore whether or not that works. And here I'm passing code.handler object as the handler object. And it's going to have a property called message just to show whether or not it works, demonstrate whether or not it works. And down here, I'm setting the handle event property of that handler object to be code.onClick. And down in the onClick, what does it do? It just adds another line that shows this.message. If I'd registered a function directly instead of a handle event object, this would be an HTML element. It wouldn't have this message property. But because I've passed a handler object, and the code that's the point of this episode is trying to simulate, achieve the same kind of features as modern add event listener implementations, then it accepts a handle event object as the this. What do we get if we click this? All right, the div, it's got a handler message hello. It got the message from that code. And the same with the button, and the button on the way up, and the div on the way up. All right, and one last thing to show here. What did we get after all of those demonstrations here? I'm just going to iterate through all of the entries object in the original code in the very first code section, and for each property I'm going to add it to this props array, and I'm also going to push onto that props array a count for click, and I'm going to show the typeCounts.click property, and we'll see what all that looks like. What did we get? These were all the registrations that were left by the end of those demonstrations. Test1, click, capture. What is this? This is the class, this is the event type, and this is the phase that it was registered as. So that was registered, test1, click, bubble, and so on. And all of these were for click, and so the count for those different registrations for click, no matter their phase, no matter their class, that total was 15. All right, so please join in for part 2, or I'll explore some of the code in the original code section here. Take care. I hope to see you then.